So even though this is a webinar, and we have lots of people here, it would be nice if it can be at least a little bit interactive. So please feel free to pop into the chat any questions or comments you may have as the presentation proceeds. And I'll try to keep track of them, and at appropriate pauses draw Som's attention to any questions that you might have written there. While I'd say just a few more words before I hand over to Som, could I ask everybody here to type into the chat where you're logging in from? Because it's always nice to see the range of places people are coming from. It's always such fun to see that. I'll pop mine in as well. Look at that, great. I'll browse at that once I finish this bit. Okay, so today's webinar is led by the very distinguished Som Naidu. Som is very well known, so many of you will already know him, and some of you will know him personally. More of you will probably know of Som through his long association as editor of the very highly rated journal called Distance Education. If you would like to get a bit more about Som's background and experience, have a browse at his LinkedIn page. Plenty of information there and a great read. We are really pleased and privileged to have Som with us today to help us to stand back from the experiences that we've all had across the last couple of years, and to help us to ask some hard questions about the future of our institutions and about the nature and kind of education we want to provide for our students. So without further ado, I'll hand over to Som now and his presentation called Reimagining Flexible Learning to Build Resilience in Education Systems Post-COVID-19. Over to you, Som.
Thank you, Sarah. Thank you very much. Thank you very much for your generosity and kind words. But before I do say anything more, let me acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands, the Wurundjeri people in this part of the world and southeastern part of Australia, from which we are operating, and we pay respects to the elders past, present, and emerging. As Sarah said, I am going to dibble and dabble with words like reimagine, recalibrate, and rethink, very intentionally, because of several reasons. And before I do go any deeper into that, let me also acknowledge the presence of many of you here today. I hope I can do justice to what I'm about to say about the topic. But let me also acknowledge the presence of so many people that I've known for a very long time. There's a whole bunch of people from the University of the South Pacific. I can see Ala's name flashed by. Dheeraj is also here. Jane's also here. So thank you, guys. I'm your old friend from here. And also welcome Mark Yonota from Northwestern United States. Mark and I were very young folks running around paddocks in University of Southern Queensland a long time ago. And it's good to see you joining in, Mark, and I'd love to hear your thoughts on what I might have to say. But let me get started with it now. So let me share my screen. Okay, so here we are. I hope you can see that. If you don't, somebody should yell out. There you go. Thanks, Sarah. As Sarah said, I've titled this presentation, Reimagining Flexible Learning to Build Resilience in Education Systems Post-COVID-19. So I'm going to talk a little bit about COVID, but not too much about it. Those of you who have been following this APODE seminar series will have heard quite a lot being said about learning, about teaching, about students, and about online education. So the big question then we are left with is, so what do we do? What do we do about it? And how do we get started? And And that's what I thought I would talk about it. I would talk about it from a bigger picture perspective, sort of a top-down perspective. Not only because, the last 4 years I spent time at the University of the South Pacific as a pro-vice chancellor, driving the flexible learning agenda. So I'm going to talk a lot about flexible learning. But before I do talk a little bit about that, I'm just going to move on to the next slide. So let me just go to slideshow. Yeah, all right, there we go.
Excuse me, Son, we're seeing your notes page.
Oh.
We can see the slide, but we can also see the notes.
Does it matter, or should I just?
Oh, it possibly doesn't. It possibly doesn't. We'll just get a small version.
Should I just leave it like this? Should I just leave it like this?
It's fine. Yeah, that's fine.
All right, I'll just leave it like this. I've got two screens. So the big takeaways from COVID-19 pandemic are as follows, and this is not something that you wouldn't know, that the impacts of the pandemic have been indiscriminate across the sector. And we know that the best resourced institutions like Melbourne, Sydney, Harvard, Cambridge, have been affected just as much as the less resourced one. But it is interesting to note that those who of us who have been following this pandemic very closely, that those institutions that have been in the business of open, flexible, and distance education have done very well. And a good example is the University of the South Pacific. When the pandemic hit in about late 2019 and 2020, USB was already on a path to online and flexible learning. So it did not really affect the operations very much as it did in other places. But the most important takeaway is the last point that I'm about to mention, that the pandemic has shown how unprepared and ill-equipped the education sector worldwide has been. And this is a very important point because, we need to think about that. Why? And this is what Sarah was talking about. The hard question we need to ask is, how has it been possible for our learning and teaching operations to be compromised so completely? I mean, we knew about online education, we knew about open learning, we knew about distance education, we knew about the role of technology, we had plenty of experience. So how is it possible that so many of us were caught flat-footed? And why so many educational institutions had to shut down operations? I mean, if you are a leader of one of those organizations, you need to wonder, we need to think about it, that how could something shut you down completely? Just imagine if you're running your household, suddenly if, say, a cyclone came by or a hurricane came by, are you not prepared for that? Or electricity went down. Are you not prepared for that? It's the same sort of questions we should be asking. Why have my organizations, if you're a vice chancellor or a deputy vice chancellor, why has my organization been affected so severely, so badly? And more importantly, why are learners and teachers so overwhelmed with moving their activities online? Not because we did not know how to teach and learn online. We knew that. There's bucket loads of literature and experience in that regard. And very importantly, the fourth point is, what does this say about how we have been preparing our learners and teachers? So it does say that our learners have not been prepared for such calamity or for such difficulty. And our teachers as well have not been prepared. So the key premise is this. We need to ask these questions, and it may be very hard because it does look bad for a lot of us. But we're not trying to assign anyone blame. The main point of my presentation is to see what we can do to institutions from an organizational perspective, so that the next time, well, maybe the next time, hopefully it's another 100 years, but I'm pretty sure it's going to be sooner, any such disruption will not have this kind of an effect. So those are my sort of preliminary remarks, and let me now then go into what the situation looks like, or at the moment. Now, let me just refer to a report that was prepared of the Australian higher education system by Ernest Young in 2018, and you can search this yourself. And this is a very damning indictment that I had to read out to you. You know, it said that Australia's universities are monolithic institutions that control all aspects of their teaching and research activities. There are 38 universities or so in Australia, anchored by physical spaces and time-bound schedule. Digital transformation is challenging this dominant model. We know that. As universities evolve from faculty-centered to learning-centered institutions, they may well find it necessary to unbundle their many functions as well as their degree programs to differentiate and maintain competitive advantage. See, this is what I was talking about. We knew about this long before COVID-19 struck, and yet we were sleeping at the wheel, if I can put it that way, and I'm including myself in that implication. Another report came out post-COVID-19. Again, the Australian education system. I can cite similar sorts of studies that have come out from the US and the UK by the JISC and Georgia Tech University, but for the sake of focusing on the Australian scene, I'm going to leave that out. But there are other studies of this that have come out of the situation that have come out of the UK and the US as well. This report came out again after COVID-19, and it was carried out by Vector Consulting and sponsored by Cisco and Optus of the Australian higher education system again, and it sort of factored COVID-19 as the tipping point. And the goal of this study was to understand how universities and TAFEs are reimagining their core function, namely teaching, research, administration, etc. I mean, this was a pretty robust study. If you look at the sample here, 7 out of 8 Geo8 universities are sort of the high research intensive universities in Australian education system responded to the survey, 78% of respondents, you know, and 5 out of 7, the TAFE, the technical further education institutions responded. So a very good sample, I might say, you know, you would agree. This are some of its findings, and I'll gloss over this to get to the main point very quickly. It found that campuses are experiencing major change, and this is at the time when COVID had struck. The future campus will have fewer people. Okay, maybe, yes, we don't know about that, but we'll see. That's what they're saying. The future campus will be more experiential and alive. Well, okay. The future campus will need to promote health and well-being. Okay, perhaps, you know, as a result of COVID-19, the future campus will have more porous boundaries to industry. Okay. But this had been happening before as well. The future campus will be more automated and efficient. Okay, well, that's good. But it's not just the campuses that are changing. All university functions are changing. It's changing. Teaching and learning is changing in so many different ways. And I'm not going to go through it in great detail because we know, for example, lecture capture and what we call remote education. I cringe every time people talk about remote education when we have terms like distance education and flexible learning that adequately describes those kinds of operations, but that's another conversation. And the student experience is going to change. There's more digital experience, more different types of learning experiences, research, industry, administrative functions. These things are changing. But here's a very important slide. What does the future look like? This was one of the questions that the survey canvassed. And I'll take this one a bit slowly because this is very important. 79% of education leaders believe COVID-19 will be looked back on as the tipping point. All right. 100% of education leaders believe digital will be increasing prominently. Prominent consideration on campus and master planning. 87% of education leaders believe digital experiences will be a bigger determinant of whether students study and stay at an institution. 74% of education leaders believe their institution is now more likely to spend discretionary dollars on digital platforms and tools. So you might say, well, okay, this is not new. This is the sort of thing that we were seeing writing on the wall 10 years before, or so years before COVID-19 struck, I would suggest. But let's spend more time talking about the road ahead. For a future-focused education, I think that a rethink and recalibration of educational as well as institutional choreographies is required. And this is the question. That is the big question that I want to spend a lot of time talking about. How do we do it? Where do we start? And I think one of the first places, if I were a vice chancellor or a DVC or a PVC developing my strategic plans, you've got to start with some value principles. What are the value principles? You're not sort of not sort of reacting to calamities and disturbances and things like COVID-19 or disruptions such as those caused by technology. You've got to have some value principle driving your educational agenda. How many institutions are thinking about things like equity, equality, diversity, and those sorts of things? In the same way, if you are going to enable the largest number of people access to education, you have to think about flexibility, because how else are people going to have access to educational opportunity? And if they don't have access to educational opportunity, their freedom is compromised. Their ability to participate in society is compromised. We are here, most of us, to a large extent because of our educational background. Education has given us that freedom to be able to be equal participants in society. So I think we got to think about the role of education and connect it with things like opportunity and freedom. And flexibility is a very important part of it. If you're not flexible, if you're not agile, then you are serving an elitist group of people, such as those that Harvard, Stanford, Cambridge, Oxford have been doing. Now, the contemporary educational organization, most of them, need to think differently. And this is the foundation that the open universities were built upon. The Indira Gandhi National Open University, the University of South Africa, they were built upon this social agenda of freedom and access to educational opportunity. And when people are educated, when people can participate in society, then the society is richer. There are economic benefits and of course, social benefits of that. So I don't think that a lot of us are thinking about these sorts of things. And I'm not saying that not all of us are not thinking about this. Many of us are. I'll come to that point in a minute. And I think we need to think about that. But I'm not saying that there's one model of flexible learning, because that one size does not fit all. And people like Aras and Ramesh yesterday were talking quite a bit about blending and mixing and matching. So I mean, all those things are the mechanics of how you get the mixture right. Where do you start to think about flexibility? And one of the things, and I want to spend quite a bit of time on this slide, because there's a lot to untangle here, and I hope I'm doing well with time. When I went to take up my position at Pro-Vice Chancellor at the University of South Pacific, one of the things that I was asked to do is to develop a flexible learning policy. So I spent quite a lot of time thinking about flexibility. So remember what I said about its value principle. Now, I came up with these dimensions of flexible learning. I mean, normally when we talk about flexible learning, we talk about things like number 2, learner content engagement. It's how the learner is engaging with the subject matter content. So institutions need to think about the engagement of the learner with the content in different ways. Traditionally, the only way that the learner is engaging with the content is either through the lecture when somebody stands in front of a classroom and explains to people what the concepts are, or by reading by themselves in the library or in a textbook. Now we need to think about other ways of the dimension, and some of those things are coming on board. Like, for example, capturing those lectures, and presenting the content in so many different ways so that they can be used by the student and reused by the student in a whole variety of ways. And one of the interesting points that I will bring up a bit later, but let me say it right now. I read somewhere quite a bit of angst about somewhere in the US, Mark, you might have heard about this, that lectures given by professors who are dead are still being used by universities. Okay, you might chuckle at that, but how different is that from reading a textbook written by someone who is now dead? It's not very different, you would argue, but I'm digressing there. When we talk about flexibility, we also talk about learner-teacher engagement. What are the ways in the learner is engaging with the teacher and the teacher is engaging with the learners? And what are the ways the learners are engagement? So traditionally, when we talk about flexible learning and how we engage with flexibility, we talk about these three sorts of things. But flexibility stretches much a lot more than that. You take about, for example, number one, learning experience design, which is about designing experiences that are flexible enough so that people can engage with the experience in so many different ways. And similarly, learner engagement with the learning environment, which is adaptable access, Wi-Fi access, mobile devices, and a lot of this already is happening. And the sixth and seventh is very important. Learner engagement with assessment activities. Usually this is something that is very tightly controlled. Now, if you want to make that flexible, you need to think about how learners will engage with assessment activities and what are the alternative ways of doing that. Of course, it raises a whole bunch of issues. And learner engagement with feedback is very important. And then, of course, this whole idea of learner engagement with the institution, especially after COVID-19, how does the learner engage with the whole institution in the opportunities that are there or not there for that? So going from those value principles that I was talking about, then you need to look at these dimensions. So if I were a DVC or a VC, I'd be looking at, if I want to make education available, if I want to make my institution accessible to the largest number of people for the reasons that I was suggesting, then we need to engage with these kinds of things. And there's a lot more depth when you untangle and unfold these kinds of things. So just in the interest of time, I'm going to move on. We might have a chance to come back to some of these. The other important point is design for digital learning. I mean, the reports that I was talking about had already flagged that the digital technologies will feature prominently in the workplace, in the education space. So I found this slide quite interesting because it was saying that there's a strategy here. First of all, you've got to respond and reflect and then reimagine and rebound. So getting the platform, getting a robust platform, adopting a digital first approach, broadening the ecosystem, and more value in industry partnership, not just relying on government funding as we're doing with other things like climate change, for example. This is another thing that was put out by Peter Bryan from University of Sydney that I found quite interesting. Space agnostic purposeful design, designed specifically for mixed modes of participation, sort of stuff that Aras and Ramesh were talking about. Breakdown and rethinking teaching and learning goes back to some of the dimensions I was talking about. Wired and leverage, of course, the leveraging of the spaces that you have. And of course, balanced and connected. These are important things. The other important thing that I wanted to bring out, this is an old slide that was developed by Walji and Laura from the University of South Africa, Cape Town University in South Africa. And they were arguing that we need to unbundle our credit programs up to a point, because when you think about it, what is the intellectual property of the universities? Universities are in the business of selling degrees, if you might say, one way of putting it. But at the moment, we are very constrained by it. Most universities offer them in packages. Here's a Bachelor of Economics, and you come and register in the Bachelor of Economics, and that's how you can get your Bachelor of Economics. Now, there are other ways of getting access to the subject matter of the BCom or the Bachelor of Economics or the BScs. Universities need to consider that. This goes to the idea of the music industry, how the music industry unbundled its albums and started selling music, bits and pieces. Now, the advantages in that, this way, not only can you optimize your product for the greatest accessibility, but it gives people flexibility to pick and choose. So if I already have a Bachelor of Economics that I took out 10 years ago or 20 years ago, I need to replenish some of that. I could go and take EC 303 if I wanted, as opposed to registering into a whole program. So I think this whole idea of unbundling is very important. So those are the things that need to be done. I'm suggesting. That's what the literature is saying. What are the key considerations then? So if we were able to redesign and design educational institutions for that kind of resilience, then here are the big questions that I have for you. What would that institutional look like? Would it look like the University of South Africa? Would it look like Indira Gandhi National Open University? Would it look like UK Open University? Or would it look like Cambridge, Harvard, Stanford? Or what would they look like? And this is the question I'm putting out to you to have a think about. How would key educational functions, including their various education services, be organized? So how would teaching be organized? How would research be organized? And how would they be managed? Differently? How differently? How would role and responsibility in relation to teaching be organized? I mean, traditionally, we've all come out of that same system. Academics get appointed, they get their PhDs in researching a particular area, they apply for a job, and you lecturer level B or assistant professor, and there you go, you start teaching. Very few people will come and tell you how to go about teaching. You are supposed to know the subject matter. But in the kind of environment that I was describing, there is a lot more going on than just knowledge of the subject matter, isn't it? A lot of academics will have to have competence in technology, in the use of technology, in thinking about how they present their content, how they get their students to engage with their content, how to design assessment in flexible ways, all those sorts of 9 dimensions that I'm talking about. Nobody sits down and talks to an academic about those 8 dimensions of flexible learning. Academics don't want to know. They are the subject matter experts. Mark, you can correct me on this one later, but I'm pretty sure that's the way it is. How would academic staff be appointed? So traditionally, as I was just saying, they're appointed for their expertise in a particular area, and under what terms and conditions. So this is changing now, and this is the point that I was making. Many universities, particularly after COVID-19, are using recorded lectures from previous semesters to run courses with a little tutorial help and no substantive control by a professor or a teaching department. Now, this is quite a different model, quite a different model of teaching. And a lot of professors will say, this is unjust, this is not right, this is not the way it's been. Unions will argue that, you're taking the independence away, the ownership of intellectual property away from academics, and you are, commercializing the intellectual, product that the universities that you are in the business of selling. And so it raises a whole bunch of issues. How academic staff, whatever, professional development will always be necessary because of the complexity of the learning and teaching environment. What kind of policy frameworks need to be in place? And more importantly, what would be different about these considerations? A recent study has come out by Peters and a whole bunch of other people, which I've cited in the references you might want to look at. One of the very few studies that are looking at how these considerations would be different. I'm getting pretty close to the end of my thesis here. The question then is, of the so many things that I've said, how prepared are we then? You ask yourself, how prepared are our educational institutions for this kind of flexible, digitally enhanced, future-focused, resilient education system? Who is thinking? Who is rethinking? Who is designing? I haven't seen too many people, but can you tell me where the examples are that people are redesigning and rethinking educational system for that kind of resilience that I'm talking about? Where are they? And I'm the first one to accept that there are examples, there are examples. And here are some examples. There is this one called Open Universities of Australia. It's a very interesting model. Many of you will know about that. There's a whole bunch of Australian universities. They subscribe to the Open Universities Australia. Open University Australia is not an institution in itself. It takes courses from other universities and markets them in different ways, in alternative ways, in flexible ways. And that's what I was talking about. So that's a good example. Navitas is another good example in Australia, and many of you will know about that. And I found that, from the Canadian situation, this idea of micro-credentials that is being promoted by in Ontario is also a good example. But here is the point that I want to leave you with. That kind of flexibility, that kind of use of digital technology sits on the periphery. Even after 10, 20 years of our exposure to digital technologies and with COVID-19, we are only tinkering at the edges, without real institutional impact. Many institutions are attracted to the affordances of open, flexible, and technology-enhanced learning, and are willing to experiment with it. Coursera, and the initiatives in the UK, and some RMIT online. Most universities, or several universities, not most, have started venturing into online operations or micro-credentialing and those sorts of things. And of course, MIT and Harvard and Stanford have actually ventured out quite extensively into that. But still, these are pockets. You can sort of count them on the fingers of your palm. But what I'm seeing lacking is institutional-wise, enterprise-wide rethink, whole institution rethink of educational and institutional choreographies. And I think that is the big challenge. That is the challenge that I would like to see the next vice chancellor, the next senior management team, the next council grab a hold of. And I'll take my hats off to people who have the courage to do so. I know the limitations of that. Of course, there are people who would hold back, just as the kind of conversations we're having with climate change, but there'll be the naysayers, of course. But the writing is so much on the wall for the education sector that we need to think along these lines to build the resilience that we need so that we are not flat-footed like the way we have been the last time. So there you are, Sarah. I've said it all.
Thank you very much, Sam. Son. How do I? What I was struck by immediately was that that final point you made about technology enhanced learning being at the periphery. And I've heard you talk about that before. It's been lurking there for many years, and those involved in whether it's distance education or online learning or whatever it is, the people involved, students and staff, have had to try to work around the systems that you talked about and these monolithic institutions that some of us are part of. I like the way that you use the word flexibility right from the beginning. Flexibility. Why have you chosen that word? Is there a reason for your choice of the word flexible rather than talking about online learning or distance education or anything else that might be that people might use these days?
But there's a straightforward answer to the question, Sarah, is that I didn't want to talk about a particular mode of, then that would be partisan. That would be going into a camp, that I'm talking about distance education, or I'm talking about online education, or I'm talking about remote. Hate the term, I'd say that publicly. But I want to talk about the value principles. Why do you need online learning? What's the fascination about it? Not because of technology. It's because you want to make education available to people. You want to give people opportunity. You want to give people choices. You look at things around you, Sarah. I mean, I'm not directing it to you, Sarah, because you asked the question. You look at how banks operate. You look at how supermarkets operate. You look at how services are. You look at how the commercial sector operates around it. It's all about flexibility. It's all about making things easier for you so that you can have a more amenable lifestyle, a convenient lifestyle. How often do we go to the bank anymore these days? Because we don't need to. We go there only when it's necessary. So this is what I'm saying. I'm not throwing the baby out of the bathwater, with the bathwater. I'm not throwing out face-to-face teaching and learning. We will need face-to-face teaching and learning and on-site collaboration and on-site presence forever, because there will be certain things that will be best done that way. And let me be very clear about that. But I wanted to talk about the underlying principles of why and how we go about reimagining our learning and teaching operations. It doesn't matter whether it's campus-based or off-campus-based. That's why I talk about flexibility and not about online education or distance education or face-to-face education. Those are modes.
Yes, thank you. I think that's very wise. From my perspective, I see that as a very wise way it shifts the attention completely to something else. Song, would you mind stop sharing your screen for the moment? And we've got such a small group here of 25, and we've got the Zoom facility to have people actually speaking. So perhaps that might be how we might proceed, instead of people writing their questions in the chat box. I invite questions from the group. Does anybody have a comment or a question to share? Mark, go ahead.
Thank you. I'm so honored to be here today. I want to ask some about that flexibility piece again, and just talk about, when I was a student in Australia almost 30 years ago, so much of the grade of the college course was based on a single examination. And I wonder how flexibility plays into the construction of examinations. And also you talked about another piece that I'd like you to address as well, which is equity. If a student isn't in a face-to-face environment, or they're online, they're in an online environment, how do you preserve equity if that is still the primary assessment tool?
Well, the main point in your statement, Mark, is if that is the primary assessment tool, and that's the point. It shouldn't be, it needn't be. In some cases, it might be. I mean, I'm not, as I just said so many times, one size does not fit all. What works in the medical faculty, in aviation industry or something like that may not and should not be applied in other fields. So we need to move away as much as is possible from this one examination or two examination. But this is not new, Mark. You and I know this. We've been through this. I mean, there's a lot of good work going on. I'm not even an expert in this area. I know so many people who are experimenting and testing and trialing a whole variety of assessment strategies, authentic assessment, and we know there's bucket loads of literature on this, so a lot of good work is going on. What I'm not seeing is a scaling out of these sorts of boutique great ideas that are happening, So we need to move away from this sort of one examination. But it raises questions about, how do you control that? How do you manage that? What's the integrity of that? Of course, there are tools coming up, which are going to get better, but they are not very robust at the moment, and they have problems and issues. So all I'm saying is that for the future, we need to think about this. I don't have a template or an answer for that. But unless you think about that, you cannot follow or explore or underwrite those kinds of value principles that I'm talking about, that education needs to pursue, and the opportunities that we need to provide to the learners. So the onus is really on people like you, Mark. You come up with a brilliant idea and say, I know this is going to work, because you see, what we want to do is we want to give people choices. We want to give people opportunities so that they can demonstrate their competencies validly, reliably, and well in a whole variety of ways. And if the model that you propose is a great model, then I'm sure people will adopt it. But at the moment, we've got lots of challenges, and some of it is technological. Yeah.
Thanks, Son. We have Jeremy with a question, followed by Simon. So, Jeremy.
Kia ora, everybody. I probably am saying this on behalf of a lot of us here. I'm part of the ITP, the Institutes of Technology and Polytechnic sector here in New Zealand. And I was just wondering, Som and anybody else, how much are you aware of the changes that are happening in our sector in New Zealand, where the government has joined all of the major polytechnics together in a subsidiary we call Te Pukenga, and their goal is to reimagine education, at least at a technical skills level, on a countrywide scale. And because of that, they're we mentioned flexibility, and you mentioned the parity and equity as part of that flexibility. If I'm just looking at their website right now, and one of their banners is reimagining vocational learning. We are building a new kind of organization to make learning fit around you. And yes, they talk about modes, and Simon and I and a couple of others have had those discussions around modes of learning, and they've had to draw some lines in the sand, and we're fighting back and stuff. But yeah, are you aware of that? And are people kind of watching?
Yeah. I was aware of that because Mark Nichols has been saying a bit around that. So because of my association with Mark and ICDE, so I knew that was happening. But this is the opportunity to tell us a little bit about it. I mean, do you think that some of the things that I'm saying is being reflected there? If it is, then I'd say, voila, great. You tell us about that.
Yeah, sure. I'm just trying to paste the link in, but it's not working. It's transcribing it somehow. But yeah, I think, in terms of the on-the-ground teaching and learning, we're still quite a way away in terms of planning and stuff. But I believe that the infrastructure that they're trying to set up is it's because equity is at the centre, and because it's a countrywide system where we have to include everybody. We can't just focus on a certain demographic or a certain customer base, I guess, if you want to call it that. Then we are having to, the conversations and the planning is around how we can make sure that everybody has equal access, and we are, the realization is that there has to be flexibility, there has to be options. And at a countrywide scale, I think they're saying that we're going to be like 36th largest institution in the world. We're going to be able to have the scale. They're talking about, as you mentioned, some blurring the lines between industry, employers, and the educational experience.
Yeah.
How can we build systems to support people in the workplace who just need a little bit of information here or just need a little bit of training there?
Yeah.
I realize I'm not the most qualified to speak to Simon or someone else. Does anyone else want to add what I've got to say?
I want to contest. I'd actually very carefully written what I was going to say, which kind of covers what you're saying, but I'm very cautious to use words very carefully in this context, not least because this is being recorded. But what the hell? I think just kind of pick on what Jeremy said. Clearly, yes, there is a concept which you're aware of already, so that Te Pūkenga is about trying to highlight that concept of flexible learning. In principle, it's about individuals being empowered to make their own life choices, their own learning choices, and that's why the entire sector is being reconfigured within that very cultural specific sort of a specific rendition of that principle for all the reasons that Jeremy's just highlighted. I think just to add a little bit of note of cynicism to that, and this is where my question was going to come, is this the reason why we don't see this universally adopted? Is there is an argument to say that although that's the stated principle of Te Pūkenga, it's still being informed by an underlying governmental motivation, which is really neoliberal economic principles, rather than about socio-cultural personal empowerment. So social personal empowerment is the gloss, but clearly it's about producing an economically viable organization in New Zealand to provide vocational training for we're a very small economy. We need to train our own people. So there is always an underlying economic set of principles or government principles. And I'm just wondering whether or not, whilst I'm like Jeremy, I mean, I'm on board with what we're trying to do. I'm not working counter to it. But I think there's a danger that if we think about some of these universal principles, we think they're great, and I think we can all sign up to them. When you try and implement them with any particular national system or state system, you're always going to run up with other political agendas. And the reality is that we generally don't control the money. Usually the money kind of is controlled by government. So I think there are some great examples, as you said, Sol. There's some great examples of people trying to do this. We're all hoping that Te Pūkenga will become something of a flagship for this kind of initiative. But I'm a little bit cynical. I don't know. Not a very positive way to end my non-question. But
yeah, it's Simon, if I can jump. I mean, it's good to be cynical, but I'd love to hear more about that. I mean, it's a group in all such situations, a group of people have to come together and think this through. And some of it you might not agree with, but the only thing that I might say, or I want to say in relation to what you just pointed out, is that when you think about the economy or the economic or rational argument, it has to have a social impact. No government is going to do anything that is only driven by it has to do. It will be concerned about skills development, about people empowerment, and those sorts of things. So it's hard to sort of disentangle those kinds of things. And perhaps, one way of looking at this will be, hey, the government has really given you a great opportunity here. Now you need to just get in there and shape it, and as opposed to saying, "Oh, bad idea, don't do this." If I were as part of that, I'd say, wonderful opportunity. Let's muscle in and let's do this, because I mean, the way I was talking about flexible learning and flexibility and reengineering, I mean, dare I suggest that I don't think people would have thought about that. Am I correct in that level of detail? And maybe this is our role. Our role should be to bring that kind of an educational conversation into the management and political arena.
Yeah, and so I mean, you're aware I'm the president of the Flexible Learning Association. That's certainly part of the conversation that we're trying to get involved in. And certainly, I mean, Jeremy and I are party to a number of different conversations across the network, basically self-generated. The individual ITPs kind of stood up and started talking to each other outside of Te Pūkenga's infrastructure initially, because we wanted to kind of get on board and make sure we understood what was going on. So no, I think we do own it. I think you're quite right. I think we do own it. We do have some power to influence it and to be able to control the direction.
Yeah.
But ultimately there is a government mandate that sort of will definitely influence the shape that we can, space that we can operate within. So it's interesting, your kind of your question about an ideal, and what an ideal organization might look like. I think my answer would always be that would depend very much on the social and cultural context of that organization and its fundamental purpose.
So totally agree, and it will differ, and so should it be. I mean, the model that comes out of New Zealand will have lessons for other people, but may not be suitable for that come out of Africa or Southeast Asia or India somewhere. But the fundamental principles, I think, are worth noting and worth learning from and taking elsewhere.
Which draws me back to another word you used, which is choreography. And dancing around these issues that you've just mentioned.
It's very intentional. It's very intentional because, I mean, what I want to highlight, and this is not the first time I used words like choreography, reengineering, recalibration, because it's designed. I remember I'm an academic, I write a lot, and I dabble with words, and I enjoy that, and the idea is to bring home the point that we need to tweak existing systems. And Simon's right. Sometimes we're stuck with existing systems that you can't change very much. We don't always have a clean slate, tabula rasa, so to speak. So how are you, and you can only tweak things up to a point. So this idea of what a choreographer does in the case of music or opera or whatever it might be, is the point that I'm trying to bring home, that we need to engage with choreographing those kinds of things. I've read some stuff in the past where people have likened lecturing as to theater, that sometimes when a lecturer comes alive in a classroom, they thrive. A lot of good lecturers thrive on the theater of lecturing, and they miss that bit about lecturing when you've got 300 students sitting out there, or people sitting out there, and you're firing away like maybe I'm firing away right now, and you enjoy it. You're on such a roll and such a high, and to some extent it is theater. And if you think it carefully, a lecture doesn't have to be just talking and shouting from the front. With technology, and if you have the resources, you can have people doing what we are doing. You can have people, if they have devices, and most people will have phones, interacting amongst themselves while you are mouthing away in front of a lecture room. So if you plan it that way, if you put markers in your lecture, if you put questions in your lecture, give opportunities in your lecture for people to engage in that kind of conversation, that is what I mean by choreography. And that is a very micro level of choreography as opposed to more systemic level of choreography. And all of these are driven by some fundamental principles. So if I were developing a strategic plan or some sort of arrangement like that, I'd say, what are your value principles? You begin with your value principles, then you organize the bits and pieces, and then you organize the systemic pieces, and that's how you build an organization. And I envy you guys in Simon and Jeremy and Mark, because in some ways the government has given you the exact thing that I am asking for, an opportunity to implement some of these ideas. Not that we don't know this. Nothing that I'm saying is rocket science. We know this. There's bucket loads of literature underneath. We know how people learn. We know how teachers teach, but we haven't put the nuts and bolts together because of lack of an opportunity, because we are stuck with archaic old systems. And those systems had to shut down. You saw that.
Thank you very much, Sam. We've just got 1 or 2 minutes left. I just want to draw everybody's attention to the chat if you haven't been keeping an eye on it. There's no particular question that's come through, Sam, but people have very kindly been popping in some links to some various reports and whatnot. Yeah. And so thank you for all of those. I've copied and pasted them into a document so that I can see them and check them myself later. would there be any one last final comment or question that anybody has before I wrap this up? Okay, well, many thanks, Tom, for leading us through some very insightful reflections you've had, and bringing it together in a way that poses those hard questions. I know I'm going away with some thoughts and a little bit more of a firm idea about why some of the things that I've kind of thought about in the past, why I should be sticking to those things, and a way of articulating them. That's, I think, very important. And some you've given me those words and those ideas. I'm hoping that others in the group are also going away with some of those sorts of things that they can put into practice, perhaps make the changes that you're suggesting, or at least chipping away at the edges, depending on where you are in the institution or what your role is. You might be able to chip away at the edges to get some of the big ideas and the hard questions asked and answered. So thank you very much, Sam, and thank you everybody for being part of this.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Bye bye, everybody.